Hey everyone, welcome to Everyday Infertility. This is your host, Savannah Keys. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast so far, welcome. This is our first solo video recording. So if you are listening anywhere where you can get a podcast, you can't see my bright and shining face. But if you are joining us on YouTube, welcome. This is the home studio that I am normally in recording these episodes. I'm super excited. I had quite a few people asking to take the video route. And so this is new for me. We are embarking on this journey together. So the first couple episodes were really focused on my background, history, and diagnosis. So I wanted to make a episode that is pretty IVF specific. IVF can be very intimidating and very scary, and there is a lot to it. So I may jump around from time to time on this episode, but I really just wanted to dive deep on my own IVF experience. I'm going to cover choosing the fertility clinic at a very high level because I actually want to do an entire episode on that. So if you have any questions specifically on interviewing a fertility clinic, how to pick one, or even transferring clinics, let me know because that is an episode on the horizon. But in terms of IVF, I'm just going to kind of start from when we found out that our only option to conceive was going through IVF and where we started. So, to start with that, I am from Oklahoma, and there's only four clinics within Oklahoma. So, I really didn't have a lot of options unless we wanted to go outside of Oklahoma and travel. So, me and my husband sat down in the beginning and we said that we would interview the local fertility clinics first. And if we didn't feel comfortable moving forward with anyone, then we would look at other clinics outside of the state and travel. It made sense for us because with hectic work schedules and really our first go at this, we wanted to feel comfortable and be close in proximity to those appointments. You don't really know what you don't know going into something. And so that's a decision that I don't regret making. Now, since we've started our IVF journey, we have actually switched clinics. So we are traveling a little bit now, but we are still within the state. Again, I'll cover that on another episode, but you have to do what's important to you. And I think the biggest tip that I can give anyone is be extremely selfish in picking your clinics. Pick who you feel comfortable with from not only a location standpoint, a doctor standpoint, a staff standpoint. Really trust those instincts and those gut feelings. I think it's also important to look at your journey as a whole long term. For those people that do decide to travel or go outside of state, don't just look at the first couple appointments. Look long term. If, look at an entire cycle. What if you need multiple cycles? I think these are things that it is important to look at in the positives and in the negatives. Like, okay, if this works and we have one round, is this feasible? Is this realistic? Okay, if this doesn't work and we have to do multiple rounds over multiple years, is this also feasible? You're not marrying your clinic. And I think that was something that I had to learn is it's okay to get a second opinion and it's okay to start over. You're never truly starting over, but going into those interviews to find your fertility clinic, be extremely selfish. Go into those appointments with a list of questions. Your consultation is for you. Ask any and every question that you have, no matter how silly or stupid you feel. You are making a huge investment. I mean, some people are literally gambling with their life savings at a chance to get pregnant with IVF. So ask every single question. That is an appointment that I highly recommend that your spouse or significant other also goes to. My husband didn't go to every appointment, so in terms of like monitoring, he didn't come to those because some of those appointments were less than 15 minutes long. But this is an appointment that I wanted him involved in, and I also wanted him to come up with his own questions. So we ended up selecting our clinic and starting the process fairly soon with them. Now, one thing that I want to be extremely transparent about is this is my journey, this is my experience. There's about a million different ways your journey and your experience can go. So I want to set realistic expectations. And from what I have heard in the IVF community is having a consultation and starting the IVF process a month later is not necessarily the norm. There are wait lists to even get a consultation, and oftentimes you are waiting a few months until you really get started. For us, and the reason that that was a fairly quick turnaround is because we went with a newer clinic. So there wasn't as much of a wait list compared to clinics in my area that had been open for a couple years. So we had our consultation in I think like late July or early August. And we were starting with our baseline appointments and blood work and all of that in August, and my egg retrieval was scheduled for September. So I think a really good place to start is leading up to the egg retrieval. Now, this can seem very, very scary, and I want to let you know that's very normal. I was meeting with my fertility clinic, and the first couple appointments were me getting a lot of blood work drawn. And when I say a lot of blood work, I think it was like 10 plus vials of blood. They want to look at every hormone level, every test available to have a good understanding of your body and a starting point. And oftentimes they call that a baseline appointment. So understanding what that looks like, they will also do a vaginal ultrasound at that appointment just to see what your ovaries look like, your uterus, so on and so forth, and just have an understanding of what they're going into. That was not meant to be a pun. But anyway, so starting out with baseline testing, and then for my husband, he also had to do a sperm analysis. Now, he had actually done a sperm analysis prior to us starting our IVF journey, but our clinic wanted to do their own, and his was over 6 months old. And so we basically just started fresh with all of our blood work and testing. And that way, our doctor and our clinic could have a full overview of both of our stats and data and diagnosis before starting the process. Once we were cleared to start the process, we started with some, I would maybe call them educational appointments. So going in and basically getting an overview of what the process would look like and making some pretty big decisions. So those decisions included how do we want our eggs fertilized? So our clinic did ICSI, which is where they actually pick the best looking sperm and insert it into the egg during the fertilization process. They did that naturally, and you could opt out of that to save some money if I remember correctly. We did not opt out because we wanted the best chance at the most amount of fertilized eggs. We also, at that appointment, talked about genetic testing. Now, we had a little bit more time to think and decide on this, but the way genetic testing was explained to us is that however many embryos are made after the egg retrieval, you can send those off for genetic testing, and they would let you know which embryos are genetically feasible. I don't know if that's the right terminology, but they would give you a report of the ones that didn't pass genetic screening, and you could decide to either keep or discard those. I'll get into all of that here in a second, but those were some of the educational meetings that we had. One of the most interesting, and I've talked about this on podcasts prior, is the SHOT educational meeting. We literally sat down with all of the medicine that we were expecting to take, needles and all, and we practiced mixing vials of medicine within the needles, changing needle caps, and even test giving a shot. Not in my stomach per se, but just getting familiar with the needles itself. One thing that I cannot stress enough that I learned the hard way is talk with your significant other or your spouse prior to this appointment if your fertility clinic has an appointment like that. Me and my husband didn't really talk about that, and going into that appointment, we were asked who's gonna do the shots, and I looked at him and said him, and he looked at me and said me. So, obviously, we were not on the same page going into that, and that's okay. It's not like we were starting shots that day, but this is a big deal. I mean, sticking yourself with a needle is not necessarily the most natural thing to a person, especially to people who are not or have ever been in the medical industry. So we went through the educational portion of that and we learned all about it. And of course, you're sent home with pamphlets and videos and so on and so forth. But I think that meeting was make or break. I am a visual learner, so is my husband. And so it was just very different holding it in your hand, practicing, getting comfortable than watching a YouTube video. Um that that appointment was big, and really after we did those couple educational meetings, we went right into our egg retrieval. Now, that probably was the most what's the word I'm looking for? That was probably the scariest part thus far. Of course, accepting IVF and picking a clinic, going into an egg retrieval was very intimidating for me. What I know now is that the egg retrieval for me was actually the easiest part of my journey thus far. Now, again, my journey is very different and I have heard very different opinions, but essentially what the egg retrieval process looks like was 10 days of shots, which are called stems because you're stimulating your ovaries, your follicles, and your eggs. So I did stems for about 10 days. And throughout those 10 days, you are giving yourself multiple shots in your stomach. You are also oftentimes taking medicine. Now, to preface, I had never done this before, this was all news to me. But this medicine and these shots are so important and oftentimes have to be done at very specific times of the day. So, my advice is for those 10 days, don't put your life on hold, but be aware of that. We actually were going through the egg retrieval process during my husband's 31st birthday. And so I had to do shots while we had people over at our house celebrating his birthday. And that was just part of it. But the timing piece is super important. And I don't know that that was stressed to me going into this. It was, yeah, you're going to have shots, you're going to take them about the same time every single day. Very different than being like, okay, you have to take this shot every day at 6 p.m. You can't miss, don't be late, so on and so forth. You're spending a lot of money, so this is important. So just knowing that for planning purposes, I wish I would have known a little bit more, excuse me, a little bit more how important the timing of was it. Another thing is the appointments. So not only are you taking medicine and giving yourself shots those 10 or so days leading up to your egg retrieval, but I was going into my clinic every other day for monitoring. Now, these appointments were super quick. I think most days, depending on how busy they were, I was in and out with like under 15 minutes. I would go in, they would start with blood work, and they would draw a vial or two of blood to test my estrogen and specific hormone levels and just make sure everything was looking good. They would also do a vaginal ultrasound to measure and count how many follicles I had. Now, a follicle is a sac that actually holds the egg. So, another thing I wish I would have known is in these appointments, they're telling you, oh, you have X number of follicles on your right side and X number of follicles on your left side. That doesn't always mean that on egg retrieval day, you are going to have that number of eggs. So that is just a learning lesson that I needed And I found out after the fact. So you're giving yourself shots, you're taking medicine, you're going into the clinic every other day, and then at the end, you do what's called a trigger shot. Now, we talk about the egg retrieval being intimidating. The trigger shot for me, because I am just a natural worrier, was the scariest part because this shot is so important that it is done at the time your doctor tells you to. Now, I didn't go into my egg retrieval knowing I was going to take it on this date at this time. It depends on your blood work and your ultrasounds. So there are a lot of things moving and changing over these 10 days. And towards the end, we were told, okay, you can take your trigger shot. Now, this trigger shot, one, is expensive. I think it was like $1,500, and insurance didn't cover any of this medicine. My doctor told me to put it in a place in your refrigerator because this medicine had to be refrigerated, and do not let anything bump it. Like, nothing should be stored anywhere near this. Like, guard and protect this trigger shot with your life. So I literally, if you know in a fridge, they have like the little butter compartment where you like lift it up and you can put butter or whatever in there. I kid you not, I duct taped that and had a little paper sign that said, do not touch. I was so paranoid about this trigger shot. I would check our fridge multiple times a day and be like, what if someone broke into my house and took the duct tape off and said, don't touch, and like touched it? I was just that paranoid. So trigger shot comes, and we had to do ours at, I think it was at either midnight or 1 in the morning. So another thing I didn't know going into this is that the timing of this medicine is so important. And depending on when your egg retrieval is, you could be taking a trigger shot in the middle of the night. I think our clinic had told us that you can take it from anywhere from like the evening time to all the way to 4 in the morning. So we were lucky with either the midnight or 1 o'clock slot. I think it was midnight. But me and my husband are also grandma and grandpas, and we were asleep every night by 9:30. So I remember like staying up, peeling my eyes open, setting like 8 alarms, making sure that he set alarms. I was telling people like, call me, make sure I'm awake, because you cannot even be a minute past on this trigger. So we go through all of that and our egg retrieval comes. Now, I am going to tell you guys this, and this is my experience solely. My clinic at the time, they have since changed procedures, did not put you under full anesthesia for your egg retrieval. They put you under what is called twilight anesthesia. So I want to make it very clear, more times than not, when you are going in for an egg retrieval, your clinic will fully put you under. You will go in for your egg retrieval and you will wake up and not have been awake for any of that. I did not know what twilight anesthesia was, and shame on me for not Googling it beforehand. But I was semi awake and semi under. So I know what you're thinking. That's scary. I will tell you that, and if you've listened to previous episodes, you know that HSG that I did was the most traumatic thing I have ever experienced in my life. It was excruciating in terms of pain. It was heartbreaking from the news that shortly followed it. But this was the weirdest experience I have ever been through in my life. So I'm laying on an exam table and they give me the medicine, and it takes a little bit to kick in. So I'm kind of laying there and I'm nervous and I'm awake. So I'm watching them prep the room and I am seeing everything that goes into it. I watch them wheel this very large cart in, and on top, it looks like it has little, I mean, it doesn't look like it had little tiny glass vials. I could see the probe with the, I'm going to call it a needle. I don't know if that's exactly what it is, where they're inserting it and then going into each follicle and extracting an egg. I'm watching all of this, and I just remember my heart beating out of my chest and like rapid pace. And I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. So I start to get a little, the word that comes to me is woozy. I don't know. I'm still awake. I'm coherent. I can see what's going on. And so they start, and I feel everything. The twilight anesthesia, the doctor going into it gave this analogy of like, if you've ever been drunk and you've blacked out, the next day you're like, oh, I remember that, but I don't. And that is how he described twilight anesthesia. He couldn't have been more spot on because I remember seeing the probe with, I don't know if it's a needle, but like, and we're talking like this long on top of the probe going into you, suctioning out an egg, and then putting it into each little glass vial. Now, it is so painful because I am not numb and I am not fully under that my husband said that he heard me screaming and crying from down the hall. I will say that there were tons of cuss words, more from me. And I remember telling them halfway through, like, you have to give me more medicine or I might pass out or die. I don't know what's going to happen first. I'm a fairly dramatic person. That was not dramatic in that moment. So they ended up giving me more medicine, and I don't really remember the last half of it, but I was awake. So I remember, and I can't believe I'm about to say this on like a podcast that people listen to, especially strangers, and about to upload this to YouTube. But since I'm giving you my raw and real IVF experience and giving you tips and things I wish I would have known going into it, I will tell you, I was like half asleep, you know, I'm like blacked out. And I remember nothing's working. So the nurses are redressing me. And after this, you can imagine there is a very large probe with like a needle like suction thing going in and out of your uterus ovary area that there's blood. Okay. I mean, this is a procedure. And so the nurses are standing me up and they're help getting me dressed and they're putting like gauze in my pants. And I cannot believe I'm about to say this. The only thing I remember from the last part of that is my doctor was like, we really need to start telling our patients, or the nurses are like, we really need to start telling our patients not to wear thongs. So that is my PSA to everyone. And if you've talked to me through social media and asked what to expect, I tell everyone, I'm like, don't wear a thong because I made that mistake and it wasn't the most practical thing for post procedure. So they wheel me down the hall and they put me in a recovery room. And at this point, I think all of the medicine has kicked in because I am higher than a kite. I am laying on a bed. They do give you something salty to eat afterwards. So I think I'm eating like Cheez-Its or goldfish. And there's pictures of me just like high as a kite, laying on this bed, like half asleep, trying to feed myself goldfish. And I remember my husband kept being like, Savannah, you need to like eat. And I would wake up and be like half asleep with a goldfish, like so close to my mouth. So close, not there. So it takes a while, they're kind of wrapping things up. And then they come in the room and let you know how many eggs that they retrieved in the egg retrieval. So the doctor comes in and he says that we got 30 eggs, which is, oh, wait, no. We had 30 follicles and they got 28 eggs. So that's really great, right? Well, I am so hopped up on this medicine that I asked, I kid you not, probably 10 times. He would leave and then I would look at my husband and I would be like, how did it go? How many eggs did we get? And he was like, Savannah, they just told you 28. And I'd be like, oh, that's so exciting. 5 minutes would pass and I'd be like, hey, babe, how many eggs did we get? So, anyways, you are loopy for the rest of the day. You are in a fair amount of pain. So we go home and I just remember the drive home. I'm coming out of the twilight anesthesia, but every bump we hit, I was just in so much pain, like really, really, really bad period cramps, but also just everything else is sore down there. So I went home. I started on stool softeners. I will tell you guys now, if your clinic is not telling you to go home and start on stool softeners, I am telling you now. That is not a suggestion, it is a requirement. You should probably also start taking them a few days leading up to it. I don't know what it is, if it's the anesthesia or the procedure, but things are just a little bit different for the days that come in the following. Now, in terms of recovery, everyone is different. For those next couple days, I ate a lot of saltines and I drank a lot of Gatorades. Salty things, in terms of drinks and snacks, are recommended so you don't get what's called OHSS, which is over hyperstimulation syndrome. And essentially, it's just where fluid accumulates where your ovaries were, and you can get extremely sick and end up in the hospital. So basically, every meal I was drinking or eating something salty. I was probably down the worst the first day. I mean, I slept most of the first day. I don't really remember much. I was like taking Tylenol, sleeping it off, and the next day I woke up, I was pretty sore. So the second day, took it extremely easy, did not move from my couch, and really just hung out there. By the third day, I was pretty much back to normal with just a little bit of soreness. So if you don't have anyone advising you, I would either plan on taking at least a couple days off or giving your work the heads up of like, hey, I'm going to take X number of days off, but I might need longer because you never know what is going to happen. If you develop OHSS or, your soreness could last a little bit longer. So after the egg retrieval, it takes a couple days to find out how many eggs fertilize and then how many embryos that you end up with. So I believe that we knew the day after our egg retrieval how many eggs fertilized. And I'm going to get the exact number for you all because there's so many numbers within IVF that sometimes it's hard to keep track with. I believe 18 fertilized for us, but it might be 16. So let me double check. I should probably know this. So anyways, I mentioned that we had 30 follicles and we ended up with 28 eggs, which, we were really excited with. And wow, now that I'm looking at these numbers, I am super far off. So we had 33 follicles and we retrieved 22, so less than I thought. We were still super excited. We did not know what to expect in terms of numbers, and we really just knew that it just takes one embryo. So we started with 33 follicles, they retrieved 22, and then we had 18 of those fertilized. Fertilization is basically just where the sperm meets the egg, and the egg is now fertilized. Now, in the beginning of this podcast, I mentioned that we used ICSI. Not every clinic uses ICSI, and some use a more traditional method where they actually just put the egg and the sperm, or the eggs and the sperm, in a dish and let them naturally fertilize. We found out on day 5 and day 6 that we had a total of 12 embryos. Now, our doctor, I feel like, set fairly clear expectations with us that every number that you get, you should expect like a 40 to 50% decline. So if you had, let's say, 20 eggs fertilized, you could probably expect 10 or so embryos. But, and he gave us a very big but, that is average and not everyone is average. Depending on your diagnosis and, a lot of factors into play, that's not the case for everyone. So I actually really appreciated how our doctor approached it and letting us know that he cannot or will not tell us what we should expect. He can only give us averages, and that we should know that an average is an average for a reason. So 33 follicles, 22 eggs retrieved, 18 fertilized, 12 embryos. We then made the decision to get our embryos PGTA tested, which is basically where they send them off for the genetic testing. That for us took about a month, and the weights were excruciating. We knew immediately how many eggs we got, and I was okay with that number. I thought, okay, 22 is a high number. Hopefully, a high number fertilizes. Hopefully, from there, we at least get, a handful of embryos. Um, so the 5 to 6 day wait of figuring out how many embryos that we had was nerve-wracking to say the least, because you are trying to keep your mind off that, but you're also like, what if, and having like the worst case scenarios run through your mind. Once you send those off for testing, knowing you have 3 to 4 weeks of waiting, that is just a mind game, because it's long enough that it's not what you think about every minute of every day, but you think about it every day and you're like, is today the day I find out? How many could it be? What factors are they? All of that. So we ended up with 6 genetically normal tested embryos. So half and half, the 50% mark, which our doctor had kind of set that expectation for us. So we were very excited to end there. So our egg retrieval was in September, and our first transfer was in November. Another thing I didn't know going into IVF were the timelines, and I wish I would have asked for just a standard timeline going into it. Now, that's a double-edged sword, because the biggest learning lesson in IVF for me so far is that no timeline is set in stone. Literally, no timeline is set in stone. For example, my first transfer, as we went into it, was set for November, and I had a date for that. My transfer actually got moved out a week because my uterine lining, was not thick enough. So when we talk about all of those appointments where they're pulling blood, doing ultrasounds, literally anything can happen, from canceled cycles to delayed cycles to cycles being moved up. Any date you get, do not take it to heart, because it can change on a dime. I have had transfers, being canceled days before. So even when you think you're clear out of a timeline being shifted, you're not. And that is the most unfortunate part of it. So we had 2 months in between our retrieval and our next transfer. They wanted 1 month for my body to rid itself from the retrieval medicine, and then they wanted another month to start the medicine and get geared up for the transfer. So the most interesting part about IVF transfers is that most people take birth control to time out when that transfer is going to be. So after that first month of ridding my body of the retrieval medicine, I went straight into taking birth control. And we ordered all of our shots and medicine going into the transfer. Now, I'm going to do a whole different episode on finances and the costs behind IVF. But what I will tell you is IVF is expensive, and most of you, if you're listening to this podcast, probably already know that so far. I did not realize how expensive the medicine will be, and also none of it was covered by insurance. So going into the retrieval, the medicine was relatively, I'm not going to say relatively affordable. I'm going to say relatively affordable compared to the transfer medicine. My transfer medicine was like twice, almost 3 times more expensive. And that's just not something I knew or planned on. So I wish that I would have kind of had an idea, because in IVF, oftentimes there's not such thing as a payment plan, and you are paying things up front to get started and get a slot in your transfer cycle. So we start ordering the medicine, I get off the birth control, and we start another round of shots. Now, this round was much easier because I had already done 10 days of shots and was fairly familiar with them. My first medications that I was taking were in my stomach, And then before your transfer, you move on to progesterone shots. Now, I'm not going to really go into the medicine that I took, mainly because I am not a medical professional and I don't want to share dosages or anything, because that is more than likely not what you are, have, or will take. So I will tell you that I was on a mix of oral medicine, shots, and then I do believe that most people do the progesterone shots before their transfer. The transfer process was similar to the egg retrieval process in the fact that once I was closer to my transfer, I was going into the clinic almost every other day, having blood drawn and vaginal ultrasounds so they could pick the day of which is best to transfer, also monitoring the uterine lining. Now, all of this is news to me. I think I keep saying news to me. All of this is new to me. And the fact that, again, I'm going into another part of IVF that I didn't previously know about. And so I didn't know that your uterine lining has to be a certain thickness to move forward in the transfer. So I'm going in, I'm getting my blood drawn, all of my hormone levels are looking great because of the medicine that I'm supplementing with. But my first transfer, we really struggled with uterine lining thickness. And my clinic wanted it above a 8, um, but ideally above a 10. 8 was kind of the lowest that they would go, and I was just hovering around 7. So my transfer actually got pushed out an entire week because they wanted to get it thicker. And that wasn't ideal for me, and that was the first time with my experience of getting crushed with a timeline moving. So we moved it out, and my lining got thick, but it never got super great. All this time, I'm doing my medicine, I'm taking shots, and I'm doing acupuncture on top of all of the supplements that were recommended from not only my doctor, but I did read the book, It Starts with the Egg. Great book. Highly, highly, highly recommend it. So we go into my first transfer, and I am so optimistic, but I am also so naive. I am like outside of my tubes being blocked and outside of some prior thyroid history. Like, I'm good. I'm healthy on paper. My husband's healthy on paper. We have 6 healthy, beautiful embryos. It's going to take. It didn't take. And that 2-week wait was the worst thing ever. I did not want to test. So you will hear people talk about the 2-week wait or the 2WW if you ever see it written out. This is between your transfer and between what they call your beta, which is a blood test that confirms if you are pregnant or not. Now, every clinic does things a little differently. I've heard people doing like a 9-day beta. My clinic did a 14-day beta, which just felt like the longest time on planet Earth. So they recommend that you do not take a at-home pregnancy in your 2-week wait because, one, it's typically too early to show up, and that early of HCG, which is the level in your blood that says if you're pregnant or not, it's best to be on a actual blood test versus at-home urine test. So I am so confident I'm going to wait until my beta during the 2-week test. I didn't. And I think it was at day 5, I caved and I took a pregnancy test and it was negative. So I tell my husband and I'm like, I'm so sorry. I know I promised I wouldn't do this and that I would wait, but like I wanted to surprise you and I wanted to have some sense of normalcy. Everyone else that I know that gets pregnant normally, they just take a test, they find out, and it's like such an indescribable feeling, and then they get to surprise their significant other, and I just wanted that so badly. I did not want him knowing the day that I was going to find out, because what type of surprise is that? It either took or it didn't. I'm either pregnant or I'm not. So I took it and I call him. I can't remember if he was home or not, but I was like, I took a pregnancy test and it was negative. And he was like, Savannah, they told you not to do that. It's too early to tell, but go ahead and just call the nurse and just tell her, and maybe she'll make you feel better." So I call our nurse at the time and I'm like, I took a test. And she's like, okay, well, it's 5 days post transfer. So 5 DPT. If you ever see a DPT, it's days post transfer. So I call her and she's like, it's probably too early to tell, anyways, but I would not recommend that you test anymore. So I took her advice. I didn't test anymore. And I go into my beta with like the highest hopes. I'm like, I'm pregnant. I've basically planned my whole gender reveal. I know what the nursery is going to look like. We have names picked out. Like, I'm pregnant. And I go into the beta and they draw my blood. I go home and I basically just hang out that whole day and wait for them to call. And I got the call around 2 o'clock that afternoon. I went in at 8 a.m. So excruciating wait, just like, am I pregnant? Am I not? Am I pregnant? Am I not? And doubts and fears kept creeping in my mind because I had taken that pregnancy test on day 5. So I get the call at 2, and my doctor's like, I'm so sorry, but it's negative. And at that point in time, I had never experienced depression, and I instantly just felt broken and hopeless. And gosh, it was the absolute worst. And I remember calling my husband and just bawling. And he's like, okay, I'm leaving work right now. I'll be home in a little bit. And I talked about, my experience in earlier podcasts. Um, but I took that time, and that day I was not okay. And those coming days, I just cried and cried and cried. And my voice is cracking now because I remember that feeling of, I failed, wow, everyone around me can get pregnant and I can't. What's wrong with me? Like, is this ever going to happen for me? The first one failed. Is the next one going to fail? Am I ever going to have a baby? Like, what the fuck? And so, you know, that was rough. And I truly had to take the time and grieve. And I'm not a therapist, I'm not a licensed professional, but if you are experiencing that, I think that's all you can do. There's no magic pill you can take. There's nothing that anyone can say to you, whether they've experienced a failed transfer or not. You will not experience, hear, do, say anything that makes you feel better in that moment. It is truly just time to grieve and cope. So, we grieved, we coped, and, a few days later, I reach out to our doctor and I'm like, okay, what's next? What can we do? So we geared up for a second transfer. And what was interesting to me is that we didn't change the protocol. The protocol is the medicine that you take, the dosages, and the timing and all of that. My doctor's thought process was, there's one in 3 transfers are successful. And so before we change anything, let's make sure that this transfer wasn't just, it not working. Let's try and see. So we didn't change the protocol at all. And we went into my second transfer and it didn't take again. And I wish I could tell you that it hurt less the second time around. It didn't hurt less. I just had a different mindset. And, really, if you talk to anyone close to me, I didn't have a great mindset going into round number 2. I kind of was like, it's either going to take or it's not. And not that I wasn't positive. I had been burned before. My heart had been broken before. And you know, it's in the back of your mind the entire time that you're gearing up, getting ready, and going through that transfer, and in the 2-week wait. So during the 2-week wait, I did not test at home, but I went in for my beta and I immediately came home and took a pregnancy test because I did not want someone on the other end of the phone saying you're not pregnant. I did not want to hear those words. And I just wanted to find out on my own. And so I went in around 8 o'clock, had my blood drawn for my beta. I went home, I took a pregnancy test, and it was negative. And I knew it was negative. And the minute I saw that it was negative, I knew it. I mean, it had been 14 days, would have shown up on a home test by now. So I call my husband crying and I'm like, okay, I tested, it's negative. And he's like, have faith, you don't know. And I'm like, yeah, I do know. I looked on the internet and it's like miracle type stuff if they go in and it's positive. I mean, the chances are small. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I just know it's not. And so I actually didn't hear from my doctor until 8 p.m. that night. And that was the hardest part because you have this glimmer of hope of like, well, I did read that story in that Facebook support group, or I did see that, Reddit feed 8 pages back that someone had negatives the whole time they were taking at home tests and then they did get a positive beta. Like, what if? What if? And it was like this mind game of like 75, not even that much, or not even that little. Like 90% of me is like, it's negative and you know it. And then there was this 10% that was like, well, what if? So not getting that call until 8 p.m. at night drove me insane. I think I called them 10 times and I was like, hello, is someone going to call me? And so our doctor finally called and he was like, your beta is negative. You're not pregnant. The reason it took me so long to call is because I wanted next steps. And really, at that point, after your second failure, that's what I was looking for. We did not change the protocol the second time. So I wanted to hear, here's what we can do differently, and here's what we're going to try. And so my doctor called and he suggested that we do some additional testing, which is the ERA test, which tests the levels of progesterone. Oh, shoot, I want to talk about progesterone. So let me talk about these tests and then I'll circle back to the progesterone because that's a big part of it. So he wanted to do an ERA, which is where they test the levels of progesterone to make sure that we're doing the transfer at the right time. He also wanted to do a test, which is called the Emma and Alice test, which tests the endometrial microbiome. It basically just says, do you have good or bad bacteria within your uterus to help with implantation? And then we also did what's called a natural killer cell test. So all of that to say, we gear up to do this testing. Now, pause on the testing. I'm going to go back to the progesterone. So both cycles, I did progesterone shots. These are needles about this long that go into your booty leading up to your transfer. Through your transfer, the 2-week wait, and then if you are pregnant, you do them until 10 weeks. I'm just going to set the expectations here. These are the worst things you will experience in IVF, typically. For me, it was the worst experience. For most people, it's the worst experience. The needle is long. The medicine is an oil. And so you feel it going in. It creates hard knots. You can only do it in very specific circles in your upper, like hip, butt area. And they're hard, sore, painful. You have to rub them out. And you only have so much real estate back there in these specific places you have to do it that over time they create these like huge knots under the surface. The best way to compare them is if you've ever had a steroid shot in your arm or in your butt and it's like that soreness for days. Imagine doing that. I think I did mine for like 7 days leading up to the transfer, and then I did them for 14 days after until beta. Now, had I been pregnant, you would do them for another so many weeks until 10 weeks of pregnancy. Now, I want a baby so bad, I would do those for the rest of my life to have that chance. So I'm not complaining, but it is the worst part. I feel like you can complain in IVF while still wanting something so badly. So I just want to set that expectation because oftentimes people reach out to me starting their IVF journey and they're like, what's the best part? What's the worst part? What did you know? What didn't you know? And honestly, just know that you're going to have to do the shots. I would go on Amazon and buy one of those electric massagers and a heating pad and get used to massaging your butt most of the day. Also, walking it out helps. So Do your shot, walk it out, makes all the difference. Anyways, so back to the testing. So we gear up for this testing, which is very similar to a transfer. They actually sometimes call it a mock transfer, where you're going to do the same shots, the same medicine, including that lovely progesterone shot. And on the day that you would go in for a transfer, I actually went in and they scrape a biopsy off your uterine lining to test for the level of progesterone, the bacteria, and then the natural killer cell is a blood test. So, the interesting thing about this ERA is that I actually um I had to try it for 3 times until we got it right. The first time, I just simply pulled a bonehead mistake and read my medicine instructions wrong. One thing about IVF is that you have to be extremely organized in all aspects of it, from dates and times in your calendar for appointments to medicine and dosing and times and days. It is a lot. And, you know, I think it was, if I truly had to dig deep, because I don't make mistakes like that, I am the most organized OCD person. I think after the egg retrieval, after 2 losses, I just kind of felt like, "Oh, I've done this before, I know what I'm doing." And I read the instructions on one of my medicines once, and, I read it wrong. And so a couple days, actually, I think it was the weekend before my ERA, I was like, "Why do I have so many extra pills in this bottle?" And it hit me. I don't have extra pills, I've been doing this wrong. And so I was taking 1 pill morning and night, and I should have been taking 2 pills morning and night. The instructions were a little unclear because it was like 2 pills twice daily, and so anyways, I think that was the hardest that I've ever cried in my IVF experience, because the first 2 transfers, I bawled. I was heartbroken. I was devastated, but there wasn't much that I could do to control that outcome. I had just spent all this money on medicine, and I could have controlled the outcome, and I just flat out messed up and wasted a whole month. Being, years in this infertility journey, wasting a month is unacceptable in my eyes. I was just so pissed at myself. I remember reading the instructions on the medicine, the pill bottle, and I hit the floor, screaming, crying. My husband thought someone died. I could not get words out. I was just screaming, and he was like, "Talk to me. I do not know what's going on." And I was like, "My medicine." So that was a Saturday night. I called my doctor on the emergency line Sunday morning, and I remember I'm calling and I'm like, "This is Savannah. I know I have my ERA this week. I just read my instructions. I took my medicine wrong. Like, is there anything we can do, or did I just ruin it?" He was like, "I'm so sorry, but yeah, we can't do that." It goes back to everything is so specific down to the dosages and the times, and I just fucked up. I mean, there's no other way to say it, and I really blamed myself for that whole next month. So, second month comes along and we try again, and my lining did not get thick enough. And finally, I was like, right before our third one, I was like, "You know what? I never had good experiences with birth control prior to this IVF journey when I was trying not to get pregnant back in my younger days. I just feel like my period has been a little wonky throughout these IVF cycles previously. And I feel like my lining isn't getting thick enough because of the birth control. Do you all trust me enough to know my body enough that I could try this without birth control?" We also switched one of my medicines, which was the estrogen, which it was pill form, and I was inserting it vaginally. I just didn't feel like my body was absorbing it. So I was lucky enough to have a doctor that listened to me. So this last round, which we finally did the ERA on the third round, um, I didn't do birth control, and we switched from pills to patches for the estrogen. And my lining was so beautiful, so thick. Those of you going through IVF, your doctor will be like, "Oh my gosh, this is such a juicy, beautiful, like, lining." That's what you want to hear. And that was the first time I heard it. So I go in for the ERA. It did hurt. I mean, it wasn't horrible. It feels like really bad period cramps, but they take the biopsy, they do the blood test for the natural killer cell, and we wait, I think, like a week or two. Those results came back. The ERA, which tests the level of progesterone, and if you're doing, not enough or too much on day of transfer, came back normal. So that was great. The natural killer cell test came back normal, which was great. The Emma and Alice, which measures the amount of bacteria in your uterine lining, didn't come back great, but it didn't come back bad. So the results came back that I did not have any good or bad bacteria in my uterus, which essentially means my uterus was a sterile environment. So my doctors and my nurses at that time thought maybe this is why the transfers aren't taking, because of a sterile environment. So they put me on probiotic suppositories to help with the good bacteria. The exact bacteria is called lactobacillus, and you can get the suppositories on Amazon. There's a brand called Vagibiome, Vagibiom. Great. They're about $30 for, I think, 5 to 10 days supply. But, anyways, my doctor put me on those for 3 months. We let my body calm down from all of the medicine, and then we geared up for round three. Now, round three, I was so positive. Everything was lining up. We had answers from the ERA. I was like, this is it. I truly walked into my third transfer like, this is it. We've got it in the bag. We've learned so many lessons. I'm in a good mindset. I'm ready for this. And all of that was canceled due to a thyroid issue. I have hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, and leading up to that, my thyroid was in decent shape. Now, one thing I didn't really touch on is in between my second transfer and my third transfer, my thyroid was in normal ranges, but not in the range that my IVF doctor wanted it in. So we were also, while doing the ERA, working on making sure my thyroid was in optimal health. So by the time I walked into round three, it was looking great and had been for a few months. So it was a huge shock and surprise when I'm gearing up for my third transfer, and literally like days before, in one of my testing where I go in and get my blood drawn and ultrasounds, they call me and they're like, Savannah, your thyroid's elevated. So we ended up having to cancel my third round of IVF. And to this point, I'm still in waiting. Now, part of that is we wanted to make sure my thyroid had time to come down. Another part of that is I actually went out and sought a second opinion. So after 2 rounds of a failed transfer, with all of the knowledge that we had around the testing that we did and my thyroid, I wanted to take this time, get a second opinion, and just understand, are we on the right path? If so, great. Or is there someone else out there that has other ideas? And so I will cover it, but as of now, I have moved clinics, and that has been a process, interviewing the new clinic, going for my baseline testing to make sure everything looks good, going through the process of shipping and transporting embryos, and then getting on their books. So that has also been part of it. So I am currently in a waiting phase, but have some exciting news coming up in terms of maybe next steps and getting everything where it needs to be. So hopefully, all of this has been helpful. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, this is just my experience. And you may be out there with blocked tubes and thyroid issues and going through IVF as well. Our journeys are still going to be different, from appointments to medicine to timelines to outcomes. So, the biggest thing that I can stress is, while it's important to have someone to lean on and hear their story and their journey of like, oh, what they do, what can I do? It's important to understand that your journey may look totally different, and that is okay. Have those conversations, hear those stories, because you will learn so much. I have asked my doctor, hey, can we do this? Have you heard about this? What about that? I've learned about so many supplements and different things I can be doing from talking with others, but that doesn't mean my journey looks just like theirs. So, if you guys have any questions about infertility or your IVF journey or anything, please reach out. I am an open book. I am here to help. And if I can't help you, I'm happy to maybe put you in touch with someone that can. But thank you so much for sticking around. This means so much to me that anyone takes time out of their day to listen. If you are starting off in your IVF journey, if you are in the thick of it, or if you have come out on the other side, you know how much of a stigma this is for some. You probably feel alone. You probably don't have a lot of people to talk about, or you're just seeing what else is out there. Either way, it means the world to me that you take an hour to sit down and listen to me just ramble on about my experiences. If there's any other topics or any interviews that you all want to hear, please feel free to reach out. You can find me on Instagram at Everyday Infertility. You can also email me at everydayinfertility@gmail.com. Other than that, I will see you guys next time. Thank you so much.